as is the way with these things, and one of them, why did I think this was a good idea moments. I went on Twitter and, looking for inspiration, said, should I do a video talking about drivers? Unscripted, unplanned, unresearched. So, let's see how this turns out then. Right. The place to start would have to be at the beginning. If we go back to the 1950s, the cars at the time obviously were basically lightly modified and slightly improved pre-World War jobs, and because a lot of young people had died during World War II, to a certain extent, so were some of the drivers in the early 1950s. Obviously, you had great drivers still, because someone getting older doesn't mean that they're not still a good driver. And the cars of that time they relied more on bravery, I think, and guile than necessarily in reflexes. So the drivers were older. To take nothing away from the likes of Farina and Fangio. Fangio obviously is, for a long time, the benchmark driver of the level that people were looking at. He is one of the greatest of all time. You can't argue that. What I'm more interested in, though, is some of the teammates he had. Collins, Sterling Moss. In terms of drivers, the character of them, for example. Collins, I think it's 56, had a shot at the title himself for Ferrari, and instead got out of his car and handed it over to Fangio, so that Fangio could win the race and take the title. Collins said it was because he was young and he had yet another shot. Sadly, he died before he got the chance to. But it's a hell of a statement of a person that they would give up their own shot at the title to do that. And it's a similar thing with Sterling Moss. Arguably one of the greatest driver to have never won the F1 title. His record in other cars is incredible. He was saying, I've got an autobiography of his, and he was saying in it that in terms of how he and Fangio compared, for example, I mean, they used to joke in the Mercedes that actually they wanted Sterling to drop further back, because running as close to Fangio as he did, he was probably doing more damage to his car than they would really want him to be doing. They were so evenly matched. But I think Sterling said himself that at the point in their careers where they were at, Fangio being absolutely at the top of his game, Sterling being on the rise, Fangio was a better Formula 1 driver than him, but Sterling considered himself to be a better sports car driver, which is a hell of a statement. But it's one thing that he didn't have a shortage of was self-confidence. The great battle of 58 between him and Mike Hawthorn, there was a bit in it where Mike Hawthorn, I think, was going to get disqualified from a race, and that would have handed Sterling Moss the title. And Sterling Moss went up to the stewards and talked them into reinstating Mike Hawthorn. Incredibly gentlemanly thing to do. You can't imagine one of the racing drivers of today doing it. And more power to him for it. But as he said at the time, the thing was, in his own, according to the autobiography I've got anyway, in his own mind, he could have beaten Mike Hawthorn. So him going and, covering him and backing him up, he thought didn't really matter because he'd get him at the next race. And that's a hell of a statement. So those two for me are probably my favourite drivers from that period. As I'm going through this list, the main thing you may notice is I won't necessarily go for the best or the most successful. I like drivers because I like drivers. There's lots of drivers in junior formula or whatever, or have gone on to DTM, who are never going to sit in F1 material and equipment, but I just like them. And that, I think, is what a lot of this video is going to be about. Some people just have a charm or a character or something else which appeals to you. And my opinions on things will not be the same as other people's. This is just my opinion. On to the 1960s. 60s period of basic engineering. Changes in cars were huge. The late 50s, you had the rear engine cars. Going forward, it was starting to get into changes in Colin Chapman, the lightweight chassis, and it was also the birth of and the period of sort of the engineer driver. So you had guys like Jack Brabham and obviously Bruce McLaren coming up with their own designs and creating their own teams in cars, going on to be the only guys to ever win in cars, carrying their own name, of course. And you've got to have so much respect for the people like that. Not even just being able to drive the car and manage their own teams, getting into the nitty gritty of trying to understand how the car works and the flow over it and the design process around it, and creating it how they want it. I mean, not just sort of what setup do you want, but actually I think there's a story with Bruce McLaren actually at one point pulled a car over and started hacking away at panels because he had noticed that they were coming up, and basically he'd found a way of it ended up trying to find a way of letting the air basically get out, and it's what he did is still used in motor racing, albeit in a more advanced manner to this day. And you don't really get that sort of level now of the driver having that amount of play in how the car is constructed, and you can't not sort of respect the guys for that. It's incredible, the stuff they were doing then, and the drive and the will to create the whole thing themselves and to push it forward. When they found that like the bosses and whatever else, I think it was Cooper they were working for at the time, didn't have the level or the ability or the drive or insight themselves to do that. And this is before, of course, we get on to some of the greats from that period. You can't talk about the 60s, without talking about Jim Clark, Graham Hill, so added to Jack Brabham himself, of course. So many to name. I mean, the start of Jackie Stewart's career as well, of course. Jochen Rindt, when he was driving at Brabham at that point before he went to Lotus after Jim Clark died. It's that period which is sort of looked on, I hesitate to say more for the designers and more for the development of the cars, because it was the birth of aero. And Jim Clark, when he had a car that worked, was ridiculously dominant. They used to say about him that you could stick like loads of engines out on the side, and basically the people who were working on them would know which one or which gearbox was his, because it looked pristine, after he'd used it. So it wasn't just fast driving, it was being able to balance between driving the car on the limit and being able to drive it quickly and taking care of the things as well. Which, when you're driving for Colin Chapman, who, added lightness, being able to take care of the equipment, I guess, is something of a necessity. I don't have a favourite driver from that period. As I said, there's so many that you respect. And it's a changing goalposts thing all the time, because if you look at the cars at the start of the decade and look at the cars at the end of the decade, absolutely unrecognisable. And I suppose you could say the same thing about the next couple of decades as well. F1 is a fastly evolving sport. If it stays still, it dies. It's the forefront and the height of technology and what is possible. So it's always got to be pushing. So sometimes the goals of the driver or the level that we associate the driver at changes as well, because obviously the people at the end of the decade tend to be facing very different challenges to the people at the front. Now, on to the 70s. So, on to the 70s, and I've already done a video about how alarming some of the designs of the cars, visually at least, looked. Again, it was a period of massive change as everyone was trying to find the silver bullet that would give them the edge. Engines have pretty much all been stuck. Most of the teams on the grid all ran the same engine at that point. So it was trying to find and develop the next thing. So you had some cars that stayed very much the same for a couple of years and then jumped significantly. And you had the drivers trying to keep up with that. At the start of the decade, you had Jackie Stewart being arguably the dominant driver, taking 2 of the first titles. He took his first one in '69, obviously, but the second one in '71, '73. If he had the car, he was the guy to beat at that point. Emerson Fittipaldi would come on to try and challenge him. Emerson Fittipaldi would win it in '72 and '74. For 2 different teams, actually, Lotus and McLaren. So he took McLaren's first title. And then after that, you had the rise of Niki Lauda. And Niki, well, we know in terms of associate Jackie with safety and whatever else, as well as the driving. With Niki, we just associate hard-edged, gritty determination. Not to sound derogatory to the drivers who came before him, but he's sort of considered like the first almost professional racing driver. You can trace a line from like him to Prost to, and it goes on as people get more into the detail and how to fine-tuning stuff, and everything becomes a process and a gel together, and no stone unturned type level of attention. And it seemed, that sort of level, that sort of thing almost seems to get associated with starting properly, at least as we are now, birth of the modern F1 driver with Niki. But during the mid to late 70s, he was the quickest guy out there. During his Ferrari period, challenging in '74, had got involved in too many incidents, ruled them out, got the car how he liked it for '75, won the title. '76 would have won the title if it wasn't for that fire and the accident. '77 did win the title despite having a falling out with Ferrari. And then you get '78 and '79, and it's like, yeah, the move to Brabham really didn't work. But for that period, he was the man. And then we move on to my favourite driver, possibly of all time, Gilles Villeneuve. And in every way, he seemed to be the opposite of Niki. Niki played percentages, he was intricate in every detail, he knew what he needed to do to balance it all out to win races. Gilles just wanted to be the fastest guy out there. Whether that was sideways, if you told him if he drove backwards it'd break the car quicker, he'd do it. I think it was like regarded as the master of destruction, because he broke so many drive shafts and various other bits, just absolutely hammering the car to the limit. And that was just the way he drove, the way he wanted to be, a freedom to a certain extent. That was how he went racing. He wanted to be, he didn't just want to win the race, right? He wanted to be the quickest guy out there every lap, start to finish. There's one incident or whatever at one Grand Prix where everyone else was going out for testing and it was bucketing it down with rain. And he, no one was necessarily taking it seriously or posting any fast times. But he wanted to be the quickest guy out there. He came from a background of snowmobiling. So going sideways sort of was kind of almost his thing. It's like, if he could go quickly in treacherous conditions, sideways, even better. He went out and in the test went 11 seconds quicker than the next quickest car, which is, but you can't imagine it today. It's utterly staggering. Just a legend, and I'll get more back to him later. But you had other drivers in it. You had Scheckter, you had Mario Andretti, who won this title the year I was born. James Hunt, obviously. There's every decade has its heroes and personalities and the great drivers of their generation. And you always look back with rose-tinted eyes to like, oh, this time there was this person, this person, this person. The 70s was one of them. The 60s was one of them. The 50s you had your guys, and then we'll get on to the 80s where we definitely had some of them. So, Alan Jones, Williams' first champion, hard-charging Aussie, very reminiscent of that period of time when we met. Nelson Piquet Senior, sort of different kettle of fish almost, much more of the Niki Lauda mould almost in terms of how he went about his racing. Not necessarily the quickest guy out there, but play percentages, worked around the team, tried to get them working for him and with him. Was a bit of a practical joker, so people like the sense of humour or what have you. Could be a complete and total arse as well, as Mansell found out. Those two did not clash, did not get on at all. You got Keke Rosberg again, another just completely gritty, tough. Hard to think how to put it really, because world champion. There's a reason why he's a world champion. Underachieved well in lots of not so brilliant cars. Eventually got a shot at Williams. It all paid out for him. He made the most of the opportunity that was presented to him. But in between all that lot, or mixed in with that lot, definitely actually the year Keke won it, you had what's referred to as the Black Summer of '82. 82 was a weird year. Everyone and anyone could win that year. Keke won the title with one win. But Ferrari won the Constructors. And Ferrari that year won the Constructors despite having at least 4 drivers race for them over the course of that season, because it all went wrong in a big way. There was a race in San Marino where a lot of the garagistas, as they're called for one reason or another, didn't enter. So it was supposed to be a straight out fight between Renault and Ferrari powered cars, and the Renaults broke down, which left the Ferraris out in front, wild of their own, happily dueling away. And everyone knows the story. Basically, Gilles came out of that race feeling absolutely betrayed, promised never to speak to Pironi again as long as he lived, and never did, unfortunately. And one of the most charismatic, most almost innocent, I think he got described as, which could translate to naive as well, as it turns out, drivers out there ended up losing his life in the next race in qualifying his own boat. I should have known that. I do know that. Brain fade. Right. So that, I've got Gilles' biography, or a biography about him I should say. I've got a book on the 82 season, and it's just like the shock factor that hit the entire grid was, sort of like, with his death something in Formula One changed almost, like, part of the spark of youth or whatever else, or energy or life disappeared off the grid, was just almost how it's described. But it didn't stop there. Later on in the season there'd be another death. And not too long after that, you had Gilles' teammate, who Didier Pironi, who of course Gilles had had the argument with in the first place, have a massive accident which then took him out of the championship while he was leading it. And Ferrari ended up finishing the season with a completely different driver lineup. And that's widely regarded as being the worst season until 1994 with the death of Ayrton and Roland Ratzenberger. I mean, it's weird that I'm sort of like reacting like that, talking about it, because I didn't even know, I was 4 years old during that point. I didn't even know Formula One was a thing, probably. But it's just like, you read the stories, you hear about characters, you find out a little bit more about them, and it's when they get to you. I don't know. Anyway, moving on, because I've got most of the decade still to talk about, and some really big names in it. Yeah, but my favourite driver anyway, Gilles. And as you get on further into the decade, of course, the guy who sort of almost took the torch over from Gilles in terms of like outgoing, flamboyant, little off the norm kind of character, Ayrton Senna. Just again, fast. You had him, you had Prost, you had Mansell, you had Piquet, and then four would just absolutely dominate the next 8 years of the sport. If it wasn't one of them challenging for wins, it was the other one. I mean, occasionally you'd have Gerhard Berger maybe get a look in, or like Alessandro Nannini after Senna was disqualified in 1989 for going like the wrong way, rejoining the track at Suzuka. But the fact that I can't really name too many more other than them after that point just says everything. But, it would change one year to another. That was the thing. I remember it as being absolute dominance from Mercedes and McLaren. Williams and McLaren. And if it wasn't one, it was the team, it was the other. So you had like Prost at McLaren and winning in 85, Prost at McLaren winning in 86 when it should have been a Williams, but they just spent the whole year tripping over each other. Then you had Piquet winning at Williams in 87, and in 88, obviously, that was the year Senna won the title despite getting less points than Prost. Yeah. Well, point systems are what they are. As it got explained to me when I've mentioned it before, the thing is, how differently would other people have driven if the point system was different? So, fair play. He won it. That was the system at the time. And then Prost getting his revenge in 89, and then Senna winning in 90, and Senna winning in 91, and Mansell winning in 92, and I've gone into a different decade, but you get the idea. It's very difficult to split them drivers. I mean, my son is called Ayrton, so obviously I think absolutely amazing driver, possibly the quickest to ever have lived. There's certain parts of his character that people will never agree on him. It's like he's almost either God or he's not, or But I was growing up in the backdrop of this, and I was young, whatever else, and trying to work out. I think I sort of was watching it almost because that was one of the few things me and my stepdad could actually get on board with, or more on the side with on, watching the racing. But the thing is, with all of them drivers also came big personalities. It wasn't just the driving you saw, it was like you got a window into them as people as well. And they're still some of the biggest names in the sport, that when people look back, that's always the period people look back at almost, to see how it seems to me anyway. But maybe it's just because I'm older. But you look at the list of names from that decade. Going back to the start: Jones, Rosberg, Gilles, Prost, Senna, Piquet, Mansell. I mean, you could throw in some more like Rene Arnoux, Gerhard Berger, Alessandro Nannini. I rated. I remember. It might have just been that I liked the colour scheme on the Benetton because it was different. It stood out. All things are possible. And then we roll into the 90s. Thank you very much for watching. If you've liked this, obviously like the video and hopefully subscribe. I should be back soon with part 2 of this, covering the 90s, the 2000s, 2010s to now, and a quick look at the future. Anyway, thank you very much. Bye bye for now.